only to find to his surprise that the Admiral was nowhere in sight. Even the tent looked quite different from the one shown on the last page of the instructions. The one there was not unlike a small house, with the man in shorts looking as fresh as a daisy and smiling all over his face as he stepped out through a door in the side and waved to a crowd of admiring onlookers. As he mopped his brow and looked at Mr. Brown's tent, even Paddington had to admit to himself that it was more like a bundle of old washing, with several lumps sticking out of the side. He hurried all the way around, peering at it closely, but there was nowhere anyone could possibly crawl through, let alone any sign of a door. Worse still, far from there being any sign of a smiling Admiral, he seemed to have disappeared altogether. Paddington anxiously tapped one of the lumps in the side with his hammer. "Are you there, Mr. Grundy?" he called. "Grr!" came an explosion from within. "That was my head!" Paddington jumped back as if he had been shot and nearly fell over one of the guy ropes in his haste to escape. "Let me out, Bear!" roared the Admiral. "I'll have you in irons for this." Paddington didn't like the sound of being put in irons at all, and he hurriedly consulted the instruction book again in case he had turned over 2 pages at once by mistake. But there wasn't even a section on how to take the tent down again once it was up, let alone anything about missing campers. He tried pulling hard on the guy ropes, but it only seemed to make matters worse, and the harder he pulled, the more the Admiral bellowed. "Paddington!" exclaimed Mrs. Brown, as they reached him just in time to be greeted by a particularly loud yell from the Admiral. "What on earth's going on?" "I don't know, Mrs. Brown," said Paddington. "I think I must have got my guys crossed. It's a bit difficult with paws." "Crikey," said Jonathan admiringly as he bent down to examine the tent. "I'll say you have. I've never seen knots like these before, not even in the Scouts." "Good gracious," said Mrs. Bird. "We'd better do something quickly. He'll suffocate." One by one, the Browns bent down and looked at the ropes, but the more they pulled and tugged, the tighter the knots became, and the fainter the Admiral's gurgles grew. It was just as they were giving up all hope of ever setting him free that a most unexpected interruption took place. The Browns had been so intent on the problem of untying Paddington's knots that they had quite failed to notice a lot of activity going on at the beach. The first they knew of it was when they heard voices close at hand and looked up to find a group of fishermen from the village making their way towards them. "We saw your signal for help, monsieur," said the leader in broken English. "Our signal for help?" repeated Mr. Brown. "That is right, monsieur," said the fisherman. "We saw it from many miles away, the young English bear from the hotel waving his white sheet in distress, and then we found Monsieur l'Admiral's boat adrift, so we came to the rescue." Mr. Brown stood back while the fishermen gathered around the tent to inspect the knots. "I wonder whether it's just Paddington," he said, "or whether all bears are born under a lucky star." "Grumph!" growled the Admiral for the umpteenth time as the story of his rescue was repeated to him. It had taken even the fishermen some time to undo Paddington's knots, and by the time he was set free, the Admiral's face had turned the color of a freshly boiled lobster. But when he heard the news that his yacht had been found and was safely at anchor in the bay, he soon grew calm again. As the day wore on, he became quite jolly and even joined in a number of games on the beach. "I suppose I ought to thank you, Bear," he growled on the way back, as he held out his hand. "Could have done with a few more of your sort on board me ship in the old days. Enjoyed myself no end." "That's all right, Mr. Grundy," said Paddington, offering his paw in return. He still wasn't quite sure why everyone was thanking him, especially as he had expected to be in trouble, but he wasn't the sort of bear to question his good fortune. "Suppose you like cocoa?" growled the Admiral suddenly. Paddington's eyes grew large. "Yes, please," he exclaimed. And even the Browns looked most surprised that the Admiral should know such a thing. "Haven't traveled the 7 seas without learning something about bears' habits," said the Admiral. He shaded his eyes as they entered the harbor mouth, and the setting sun flickered for a moment behind the houses. "Don't suppose you've ever tasted real ship's cocoa," he said. "Make it myself in a bucket. How about coming up to me cabin for a cup before you go to bed?" To that, the Browns gave an enthusiastic, "Aye, aye," and even Paddington was allowed to raise both his paws in agreement. It had been a most exciting and enjoyable day, and although they had none of them so much as seen a glimpse of a sardine, let alone caught one, they all agreed there was nothing like a cup of real ship's cocoa to round things off in a proper seaman-like fashion.